Consider Aquinas' definition of a law. He says that a law is an ordination of practical reason for the common good promulgated by one who is in charge of the community. I want to focus on three words in that definition. Okay, reason, common, and good. And Aquinas gives interesting arguments for the inclusion of each of those in his definition of a law. Let's start with reason. Imagine that there is a prince who's issued a decree that everyone over a certain height, say taller than himself, should be stoned. Imagine he's 6 feet tall. He says, if you meet anyone over 6 feet tall, thou shalt stone him immediately, otherwise you've done something illegal. Aquinas would say, that's not a real law. It has sort of the semblance of a law because it does meet some necessary conditions for lawhood. For example, it's been issued by someone who's in charge of the community. But it fails to meet one necessary condition, namely it's not reasonable, and therefore it fails to be a law. What he says is that in that case, the will of the prince would be iniquity rather than law. Here, Aquinas is following Augustine. Augustine, you'll recall, denied that something becomes just simply because it's been ordered by the Roman authorities. Okay, it was commonly thought then that there was no way of acting unjustly towards foreigners, because what was just depended on what the authorities required, and it only applied then to behavior of Roman citizens within the Roman Empire. Augustine denies that. He says that what's just ultimately hinges not on what the authorities require, but on what the moral law requires, and therefore it is possible to act unjustly in warfare. Aquinas agrees. He would say that if that what's just in a state doesn't hinge on what this particular prince happens to require. It doesn't become just to kill people taller than 6 feet tall just because he has demanded it. Okay? What's just ultimately hinges on what the moral law requires. But something can't be both unjust and immoral and a law. Therefore, it's not a genuine law. Okay? I'm curious what you think. Imagine that a law like that were passed in America. Okay, everyone over a certain height should be stoned, or everyone under a certain height should be stoned. Do you think that would be a real law? Okay, would it be a law that's just flagrantly immoral to follow, or would it just not be a real law? It's a tough question, and I'm curious what you think about it. It's something you can discuss on Canvas. Secondly, a law is an ordination of practical reason for the common good. So that word common. So he says that law is directed at the common good, not merely at the good of some. And his argument for this moves quickly. He just says this: citizens are part of a whole, seems right. Therefore, law must concern itself with the whole. There seems to be a tacit premise or two there that our modern minds just aren't quite understanding. I think the idea is this. In his view, a community only becomes a state when there are laws that govern everyone's behavior. Otherwise, it's just a community. So it's part of just the meaning of a state that there are laws governing everyone's behavior. Okay. So when he says a law is an ordination of practical reason for the common good, he's just saying that's part of what it is to be a state, is that there are laws, ordinations of reason, governing everyone's behavior. Otherwise, it's just not a state. It's just a matter of definition. Suppose we respond to him like this. We say, suppose that there's a community of people and there are laws A, B, and C governing everyone's behavior. Okay, they're binding to everyone. But then there are also laws D and E that only apply to some. Okay, can D and E be real laws if they only apply to some? Well, apparently he's going to say no, because to be a law, it has to apply to everyone. But the question is why? Okay, does he have sort of the resources, or do we have the resources to explain why there can't be some laws that are only binding on some? Okay, so I'm curious what you think. Does a law have to apply to everyone, or can you have some things that are real laws that only apply to some citizens? Finally, the word good. Okay, a law is an ordination of practical reason for the common good. So what sort of good is being achieved by laws? Aquinas' answer is virtue. He says this, his words, law will make men good. Okay. Now, what exactly is virtue? Well, in his view, it is a behavioral disposition to do good. So is vice. Vice is a behavioral disposition to do bad. In other words, virtues and vices are habits, good or bad habits. When you get in your car, you put on your seatbelt. 2 minutes later, you've probably forgotten putting it on. You don't remember doing it, but there it is. It's on. Okay. When you were a kid, you had to be told, put on your seatbelt repeatedly. Okay. And you had to be reminded and reminded. But eventually, you didn't forget, and you just put it on so many times that it became a habit, and now you don't even think about it. In Aquinas' view, and here he's following Aristotle, that's how, at least one way in which virtues are formed is just by repetition of good actions. Actions that just don't feel natural to you, but if you do them enough, they become natural. You develop a disposition to do it. And when you develop a disposition to do something that's good, then you have a virtue. If you perform bad acts enough till it becomes a disposition to do those bad things, then you have a vice. Okay? Well, laws of the state, in Aquinas' view, are meant to develop, meant to require certain repetitions of good behavior and to prevent repetitions of bad behavior, and therefore to prevent the development of certain vices and to promote the development of certain virtues. Now, he grants that law can't make us morally perfect because law can only concern itself with our overt behavior, the way we actually move our bodies, because we don't know what's going on in one another's minds. He says there is a law, the divine law, that applies to our mental life and how we should think. Okay, so consider, for example, some of Jesus' most famous words. So here's what Aquinas is thinking of. In the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you've heard it said that you should not commit murder. But he says, but I tell you, don't even hate. Okay, don't even harbor hate in your heart. Or you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I'm telling you, don't even lust over people. So what Jesus is saying is, look, morality is not just about the way we happen to move our bodies. He's saying it's also about your attitudes, okay, your sort of mental life, for lack of a better expression. Aquinas is saying the laws of the state can't govern that mental life, our attitudes. Only the divine law can do that. And so therefore it can't make us perfect, but it can develop some virtues, and that's the aim of the laws of the state, is to develop certain virtues. Consider something that here is a passage from Aquinas. He says that the power or capacity to act results from a habit or interior disposition. Not everything is possible for both the virtuous man and the one who does not have the habit of virtue, just as the same thing is not possible for the child and for a full-grown man. Therefore, he says, many things are permitted to children, which would be punished or at least criticized in adults, and similarly, many things are allowed to men who are not advanced in virtue that would not be tolerated in a virtuous man. Now here's the key bit. Human law, he says, is framed for the mass of men, the majority of whom are not perfectly virtuous. Therefore, human law does not prohibit every vice from which virtuous men abstain, but only the more serious ones from which the majority can abstain, especially those that harm others and which must be prohibited for human society to survive, such as homicide, theft, and the like. So he's saying that people vary in their degree of virtue. Okay, and there are some virtues that are only for the advanced, okay, for the very virtuous, and the common sort of rung of men don't have those virtues, and therefore they couldn't follow a law that required them to act on them. Okay, and so the only things that are sort of required by law are the things that everybody can do. Okay, so don't murder, don't steal, etc. The things that he says are required for human society to survive. Question. He has limited the laws to those that are required for human society to survive. Is he still in a position to say that the goal of laws is to make us virtuous? Okay, given that he said there are lots of things that we should do, morally speaking, lots of things that the ideally virtuous person would do that are not required by law. Laws, the laws are only requiring those things of us that we need in order to survive as a society. Why shouldn't he just say then that the goal of laws is really just for a society to survive? Is he still in a position to say, or fundamentally, it's about making us better, okay, morally better? Why can't he just forget, or why shouldn't he just forget this aim of producing virtue and just say, well, that's a good thing, but that's not what the laws are doing. The laws are just about surviving as a society. So is there a way to argue, to defend him and say, yeah, there actually is, they are trying to produce virtue. But at the same time, like Aquinas says, they can't be aimed at every virtue. Okay, they can only be limited to these ones that everyone can perform and that are just necessary for survival. But at the same time, it's not actually survival, it's virtue that is the fundamental aim. Okay, is there a way to argue for that?